Welcome to Big Papa Rob's podcast Story Rewind. I'm Big Papa Rob. Here I rewind the story of a person, place, or thing and tell you where it originated from. Today's story will be a little different than normal. This is the story about the worst industrial accident in Massachusetts history. A mill that collapsed, killing at least 145 workers and 166 injured. This is the second story of a series related to tragic work-related incidents that led to states and eventually our government to enact laws to protect the American worker. Let's rewind the story to its early beginnings. This mill was in Lawrence, Massachusetts. Lawrence in the 19th century was a mill town, kept running by investors' money from Boston and the labor of manual labor workers from all over. Most of the workers in this mill were women of Scottish and Irish descent. The Pemberton Mill building was erected in 1853 for $850,000, which would be equivalent to about $30 million today. This building was 5 stories tall, 280 feet long, 84 feet wide. During the financial panic of 1857, the investors of this building sold it at a significant loss for $325,000 to David Nevins Sr. and George Howe. They quickly wanted to seek a return in their investment by filling the factory with as much equipment as possible. They filled the ground floor with 400 looms and the upper levels with more textile equipment than the building was designed for. At the peak of this factory, it produced 150,000 yards of cloth per week, grossing $1.5 million a year. January 10th, 1860, was a mild day and unseasonably warm. The Pemberton Mill was in full operation with 600 workers that day. Because of the warm weather, some of the workers were eating their lunches on benches outside the factory. At 4:52, one of the workers outside recalled hearing a rumble like a bear snoring, and moments later heard the resounding clang, crash, along with screams of workers within the collapsing factory. There were workers on the 4th floor moving equipment by placing straps around one of the pillars. After moving the equipment, they felt the floor settled just before the collapse. Inside the factory, a worker recalled a deep vibration within the 5-story building, and around 4:45, several workers were scalded by a burst steam pipe. Another worker on the top floor felt a structure quake. Sensing the worst, she dashed for the elevator and descended to the ground, and her swift response saved her life. The 5th floor, made from oak 6 inches thick, was the first to collapse. From the center falling onto the floor below, the cast iron pillars, timber supports, continued to buckle and snap, bringing down with them the heavy machinery. Within 60 seconds, the main building had collapsed. Most of the 600 employed in the factory were dead or trapped, stuck in a pyramid of destruction rising over 50 feet. Many of the reports I read stated children as young as 4 were in the building when it collapsed. Many of the people of Lawrence rushed to the scene of the disaster and quickly organized rescue efforts. There were many people still alive and trapped in the rubble of what was left of the building. Rescuers reported that many victims were so mangled that they were unrecognizable. Some of the trapped survivors assured their friends that they were uninjured but were imprisoned by the timbers on them. As darkness fell upon the site, rescuers built bonfires to keep warm and to warm the survivors that were being pulled from the crumpled building. With darkness, it became harder for the rescuers to find victims. By 9:30 p.m., there were still hundreds of people still trapped in the collapsed mill. Around this time, somebody accidentally knocked over an oil lantern. The flames quickly spread through the debris, fueled by raw cotton, textiles, wood beams, and oil leaking from the machinery. As the fire grew, it pushed rescue attempts out because of the fire, smoke, and heat. Rescue workers and family members could do nothing but watch in horror as the trapped victims screamed when the fire began to reach them. Still trapped, and there's no way to escape from being burnt alive. There were dozens of reports of family members having to watch their own loved ones burn alive. There was one report of a gentleman who cut his own throat with a pocket knife to avoid suffering from the approaching flames. He was later rescued from the rubble, but only to die from self-inflicted wound. Another report that rescuers found 2 women who died clutching one another in their death. Reports after the collapse stated that within the first 6 hours, 200 workers were pulled from the wreckage alive. 166 workers were injured, and up to 145 workers died either by the collapse or the fire that ensued. There were at least 17 bodies transferred to a room in the city hall that were so badly mangled that they asked relatives to try to identify them by what was left of their clothing. The day after the tragedy, the New England Society for Promotion of Manufactures and Mechanic Arts started to raise money for the victims and surviving family members of this tragedy. A committee of relief was formed January 15th. They took charge of the collection of money and articles for the victims and distributed funds and articles to the victims and their families. This committee collected about $65,000 during this time. Unfortunately, it was reported that the distribution of aid was colored by the assumption about class, immigration, and nature of work. Head of household received the most of the distribution monies, with some receiving $500 for beneficiaries. But when it came to many of the young women that weren't even adults, the allotment had a smaller range and only garnered between $50 and $100. A jury was swiftly assembled to decide culpability. They quickly agreed that there was no evidence of criminal intent on behalf of the owners, even though they overloaded the building with equipment and installed steel plates for support, but were not installed in the right places to give support for the overloaded equipment they moved in. Furthermore, employees were instructed to use the support pillars to move equipment by tying straps around them. They were doing this the moments before the collapse. Further investigation of the collapse determined that the building was poorly constructed in the first place. The metal beams were made of low-quality steel that was brittle. The bricks had not been properly mortared. The biggest issue found was with the cast iron pillars. They were found to be uneven thicknesses within the walls caused by careless set molds. It was also determined that they were spaced too far apart. The culpability was found to lie with the foreman of the foundry that manufactured the inferior pillars, as well as Captain Charles Bigelow, the architect. After Mr. Bigelow was found responsible for the collapse, he wrote a letter to the newspaper blaming the manufacturer of the pillars, stating that he had no way of knowing that they were inferiorly made. Even though Mr. Bigelow was found at fault, there was no punishment. He went on to continue his career as an engineer and died of TB in 1862. The Pemberton Manufacturing Company received $93,000 from insurance company for the disaster. The owners liquidated its assets, and George Howe sold his half to his partner David Nevins, who then rebuilt the mill on the property in the winter of 1860, calling it Pemberton Company, and was in operation for the next 78 years. One day after the disaster, John C. Tucker, a Boston representative, requested that there be legislation that would require inspection of workplace, public buildings regarding public safety. That made it all the way to the Senate, but was killed on April 4th, 1860. During this time in our country, it was the insurance companies that ended up making construction and manufacturing companies comply with certain building codes, or they would not be covered by insurance. Since our government at the time didn't want to inconvenience the big companies that influenced politics heavily during those days. Despite the outrage and shock following the collapse, the legal system did not yet recognize the need for workers' protections, as public support was not widespread enough and large businesses still held great power. It wasn't until the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire that employers began seriously considering workplace safety reform. If you didn't listen to last week's story about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, I suggest you go back and listen to that one. It's hard to believe that the owners of these businesses allowed greed to cloud judgment and turn a blind eye to worker safety. There were so many workers injured that went unreported in those days. I saw several smaller stories of employees getting caught in machinery and being injured and even killed that worked for this factory before the massive disaster. Next week, I'll cover another work-related disaster. The following week, I'll tie in how last week's story, this week's story, and next week's story of the tragic events help form and create what we know as OSHA today. Thank you for listening today. I hope you come back next week for my next story in this series. The stories will be ever-changing, from historical origins of many things, the story of people that you may not know their history. And again, I'm Big Papa Rob, and this was Story Rewind, an independent podcast. Story Rewind is written and produced by Big Papa Rob, storyline edited by my beautiful wife, Amanda, aka Big Mama. Today's music was powerful, stylish stomp rock by Mark July from Pixabay. This was a Big Papa Rob podcast 2023.